The bitter wind howled through the alleyways as 12-year-old Tommy pressed himself against the warm kitchen vent of the Sterling mansion, his frozen fingers clutching an empty soda can while his stomach growled in protest through the steamy kitchen window. He watched the usual dance of servants preparing dinner when something unusual caught his eye. Mrs. Sterling, the elegant trophy wife of billionaire James Sterling, slipped into the kitchen like a shadow, her designer heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Tommy had seen Mrs. Sterling many times before during his 6 months living in this alley. She always walked with her nose in the air, treating the house staff like they were invisible. But tonight something was different about her usual confident strut was replaced by nervous energy, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her thigh as she pretended to inspect the dinner preparations. The kitchen staff visibly tensed at her presence, their easy chatter dying down to uncomfortable silence. From his hidden vantage point, Tommy watched as she waited for the head chef to leave the kitchen to retrieve something from the wine cellar. It was then that her true purpose became clear. Quick as a cat, she moved to the elaborate tea service that had been prepared for Mr. Sterling. Tommy knew it was his because he had overheard the staff discussing the billionaire's strict evening routine. Every night at exactly 7:30, he would have his special blend of imported tea in his study while reviewing the day's business reports. Mrs. Sterling glanced furtively around before pulling a small purple package from her Hermes purse. With practiced movements, she tapped a fine powder into her husband's favorite teacup, her red lips curving into a satisfied smile. Tommy felt his blood run cold as he recognized the package from his time on the streets. It was the same industrial-strength rat poison that had killed his only friend, a stray dog named Max. Just last month, he had watched helplessly as Max suffered through the effects of the poison after eating contaminated food from a restaurant's trash. The memory of Max writhing in pain made Tommy's chest tighten as he watched Mrs. Sterling carefully stir the tea, ensuring the powder dissolved completely, leaving no trace of her deadly intent. She then rearranged everything exactly as it had been before, adding an extra sugar cube to the saucer, something Tommy had noticed Mr. Sterling never used in his tea. Just then the head chef returned, and Mrs. Sterling smoothly transitioned into criticizing the dinner menu, her voice sharp and demanding, as if she had been there for that purpose all along. Tommy remained frozen in his hiding spot, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just witnessed. Through the steam-clouded window, he could see the purple package disappearing back into her designer purse. Next to it, he caught a glimpse of something else that made his heart skip several beats. It was a thick envelope stuffed with what looked like $100 bills. Mrs. Sterling lingered in the kitchen for a few more minutes, making a show of inspecting the evening's dinner preparations, but Tommy could see the satisfied glint in her eye every time she glanced at the tea service, her perfectly painted lips occasionally curling into a small smile that sent chills down his spine. He had seen that same cold, calculating look in the eyes of predators who roamed the streets at night. As she finally left the kitchen, her heels clicking away down the marble hallway, Tommy noticed she had left something behind on the counter. It was the empty poison package, partially hidden behind a flower canister. Without thinking, he pulled his worn smartphone from his pocket, the one possession he had managed to keep charged thanks to the outdoor outlet behind the restaurant next door. With trembling fingers, he snapped several photos through the window, knowing that having proof might be important. The kitchen staff resumed their duties, none the wiser to what had just transpired. Tommy watched as they continued preparing the elaborate dinner, occasionally adding finishing touches to the tea service that now harbored a deadly secret. His mind raced with the weight of his knowledge. In the past 6 months of living in this alley, he had witnessed Mr. Sterling doing countless acts of kindness. The billionaire had quietly funded the homeless shelter 3 blocks away, paid for medical care for street kids, and always ensured the kitchen's leftovers were properly packed and placed in the alley instead of being thrown into the dumpster. These small acts of kindness had helped Tommy and many others survive the harsh winter months. Now, as the evening grew darker and colder, Tommy huddled closer to the warm vent, watching the steam rise from the poisoned tea service, his conscience waging war with his survival instinct. He knew getting involved could put his life in danger. Mrs. Sterling was clearly dangerous and had resources, but staying silent meant being complicit in murder. The face of his friend, Max, flashed in his mind, again along with the memory of his own parents who had died because someone had chosen to stay silent when they knew something was wrong. Tommy tossed and turned in his makeshift cardboard shelter that night, his mind replaying the scene in an endless loop, sweat beading on his forehead. Despite the freezing temperature, the streets had taught him one golden rule: mind your own business. To survive, those who stuck their necks out for others usually ended up dead. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mr. Sterling's kind face, the man who had secretly paid for the local shelter to stay open through winter, who made sure the homeless kids got warm meals and winter coats, while his wife complained about encouraging vagrants. The bitter memories of his own parents' death crashed over him like waves, threatening to drown him in guilt. 2 years ago, he had overheard the local drug dealers planning a raid on his parents' small convenience store. They had refused to pay protection money, and Tommy had heard every detail of the planned revenge, but fear had sealed his lips. He had told himself it wasn't his problem, that getting involved would only make things worse. Now he lived with the knowledge that a single warning could have saved their lives. Rolling onto his side, Tommy pulled out his battered phone, looking at the photos he had managed to capture through the kitchen window. They were slightly blurry through the steamy glass, but the purple package was clearly visible in Mrs. Sterling's manicured hands. He zoomed in on her face, catching the code calculation in her eyes as she stirred the poison into the tea, the same expression she wore when ordering the shelter closed last month, claiming it brought down property values. A police siren wailed in the distance, making Tommy flinch instinctively, his mind wandering to the officers who had questioned him after his parents' murder. They had known he was holding something back, but he had been too terrified to speak. The memory of their disappointed faces haunted him almost as much as his parents' smiles from the morning of their last day. The wind howled through the gaps in his cardboard shelter, reminding him of his precarious position. If he spoke up, Mrs. Sterling would know exactly where to find him. She had connections to everyone who was anyone in the city. Her charity galas and social events were legendary for bringing together the city's elite. Tommy had overheard enough of her phone calls through the kitchen window to know she could destroy someone with a single conversation. Yet as he lay there shivering, another memory surfaced. Last week, he had watched Mrs. Sterling stop his car in the middle of a snowstorm to help a homeless veteran. The billionaire had not only given the man his own coat, but had personally driven him to the veteran's shelter and made calls until he was guaranteed a permanent place to stay. Tommy had watched from his usual spot as Mr. Sterling returned to his car with snow in his hair and a satisfied smile that reminded him so much of his own father. Pulling his thin blanket tighter, Tommy thought about all the other street kids who depended on Mr. Sterling's quiet generosity: the weekly food deliveries to the shelter, the medical clinic that mysteriously never charged homeless patients, the job training program that asked no questions about people's past. If Mrs. Sterling succeeded in her plan, all of that would vanish, replaced by her cold efficiency and disdain for those she considered beneath her. His phone buzzed with a low battery warning, the screen illuminating a small photo wedged in its case. It was the last picture taken of his family, his father proudly standing in front of their store, his mother smiling with her arm around Tommy. They had built that store from nothing, working endless hours to give him a better life, all of it destroyed because he had been too afraid to speak up. Rolling onto his back, Tommy stared at the stars barely visible through the city smog. Tomorrow evening, Mr. Sterling would sit down in his study, pour his usual cup of tea, and if Tommy did nothing, history would repeat itself. Another good person would die because someone who could have prevented it chose to look the other way. The weight of his parents' memory pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Somewhere in the darkness, a stray dog howled, reminding him of Max and the horrible way he had died from the same poison that now waited in Mrs. Sterling's favorite teacup. Tommy sat up, suddenly his decision crystallizing in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. He had failed to save his parents, he had failed to save Max, but he could not fail to save Mr. Sterling, even if it meant putting himself at risk. Sleep was impossible now as he began to plan how he would warn the billionaire, knowing that his next actions would either make him a hero, or cost him everything, including possibly his life. Tommy's heart thundered in his chest as he snuck past the distracted security guard, his threadbare sneakers silent on the polished floor of Sterling Industries. The morning cleaning crew barely glanced at him, assuming he was another worker's child, but the executive floor secretary gasped at his appearance. Before he could be thrown out, Tommy blurted out, "Mrs. Sterling, your wife is trying to kill you." The words echoed through the marble lobby, drawing stunned silence from everyone within earshot. The next few moments passed in a blur as security rushed forward, their hands reaching for Tommy, but Mr. Sterling emerged from his office, his commanding presence freezing everyone in place. One look at the boy's desperate face, and Sterling raised his hand, halting the guard's approach. Even from across the lobby, Tommy could see the dark circles under the billionaire's eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that hadn't been there weeks ago, signs of the slow poisoning that had already begun. Instead of calling security, Sterling invited Tommy into his office, the massive room with its floor to ceiling windows making the boy feel smaller than ever. His dirt streaked reflection in the polished desk reminded him just how out of place he was in this world of power and wealth, but the weight of his phone with its damning photos gave him courage. Mr. Sterling listened intently as Tommy spilled every detail, from the purple package to the secret phone calls he had overheard Mrs. Sterling making in the garden. Sterling sat motionless, his face growing paler with each word, as 20 years of marriage suddenly took on a sinister new light. Tommy could see the man's hands gripping his desk harder as he described watching Mrs. Sterling mix the poison into the tea, explaining how he recognized the package from his time on the streets. When Tommy mentioned Max and how the dog had died, Sterling pushed away from his desk and walked to the window, his broad shoulders tense with emotion. Reaching into his pocket with trembling hands, Tommy pulled out his phone, showing Sterling the photos he had managed to capture through the kitchen window. They were grainy but clear enough to show Mrs. Sterling in the act, the purple package visible in her hands. Sterling stared at the images, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, as Tommy explained how he had been watching the mansion for months, describing details about the daily routine that only someone who had been paying close attention would know. The billionaire turned back to his desk, pressing a button that brought up security footage of his own kitchen. The cameras had caught everything from a different angle, confirming every detail of Tommy's story. Sterling sank into his chair, his face ashen, as he watched his wife, the woman he had trusted for 2 decades, methodically attempt to murder him. Tommy stood awkwardly, unsure what to do as the powerful man before him struggled to process this devastating betrayal. Finally, Sterling spoke, his voice rough with emotion, asking Tommy why he had chosen to come forward, why risk everything to save someone he barely knew. Tommy found himself telling the story of his parents, how his silence had cost him everything he had ever loved. He explained all the homeless shelter, about watching Sterling help others when he thought no one was looking, about how the world needed more people like him, not fewer. Sterling listened with growing intensity as Tommy described the network of charity and kindness the billionaire had built, how many lives depended on his quiet generosity. The man seemed surprised at how much impact his actions had had, unaware that the street community had been watching and benefiting from his humanitarian work all along. Tommy explained how Mrs. Sterling had been secretly undermining these efforts, threatening to close shelters and cut funding to community programs. As Tommy finished speaking, Sterling stood and walked to a side door, opening it to reveal a small security room filled with monitors. He spoke quietly to someone inside, then returned to face Tommy with newfound determination in his eyes. He pressed another button, and his personal security team entered the office, their faces grim, as Sterling began issuing rapid-fire orders to begin an immediate investigation. Watching the flurry of activity, Tommy felt the exhaustion of his sleepless night catch up with him. He swayed slightly on his feet, causing Sterling to notice and immediately call for food and water. The billionaire guided Tommy to a comfortable chair, studying the boy with new eyes as he realized this child had just saved his life at great personal risk. Sterling pulled up another chair, sitting eye level with Tommy as his security team worked in the background. "Now," he said gently, "tell me everything about yourself and how you came to be watching over my house like a guardian angel. Elite private investigators moved like ghosts through the city's underbelly while Mrs. Sterling remained oblivious to the net closing around her. Former FBI agent turned private detective Sarah Chen led the investigation, her reputation for discretion and thoroughness making her the perfect choice to unravel Mrs. Sterling's web of deceit. Within hours, her team had uncovered a pattern that left even the most hardened investigators shocked. Working from an unmarked office 3 blocks from Sterling Industries, Chen and her team meticulously pieced together months of surveillance footage from the mansion's security cameras that Tommy hadn't known existed. They watched in growing horror as Mrs. Sterling systematically poisoned her husband in careful doses, starting with barely detectable amounts in his morning coffee, gradually increasing the toxicity while making it appear that his health was naturally declining. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls to Anthony Blake, a rising star at Sterling's biggest competitor Monarch Industries. The calls always came from a burner phone registered under a fake name, but Mrs. Sterling had slipped up once using her personal phone during what appeared to be an emergency call. The conversation had been recorded as part of standard security protocols at Sterling Industries, revealing intimate details of their affair and their plans to take over the company. Chen discovered Mrs. Sterling had been secretly attending medical conferences under an alias, learning about untraceable poisons and their effects on the human body. Her credit card statements showed purchases of rare toxins from the dark web using cryptocurrency, but she had forgotten to clear her computer search history, which revealed extensive research on poisons that mimicked heart failure, a crucial mistake that would later prove devastating in court. The investigation took an even darker turn when Chen's team found evidence that Mrs. Sterling wasn't Mrs. Sterling's first victim. 3 years ago, her wealthy uncle had died under mysterious circumstances, leaving her a substantial inheritance. The case had been ruled natural causes, but Chen found disturbing similarities in the pattern of symptoms the uncle had displayed before his death. Tommy, who had been given a secure room at Sterling Industries under the guise of being part of a youth outreach program, helped the investigators understand the layout of the mansion and Mrs. Sterling's daily routines. His months of observation proved invaluable as he pointed out hidden spots where she made her secret phone calls and identified staff members who might have unwittingly assisted her schemes. Bank records revealed a complex network of offshore accounts set up to receive funds once Mrs. Sterling was dead. Mrs. Sterling had meticulously planned to transfer the company's assets immediately upon his death using forged documents that granted her full control. The investigators discovered she had already started quietly selling off smaller company assets, converting them to untraceable cryptocurrencies. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of a second plot. Chen found evidence that Mrs. Sterling had hired a backup hitman to stage a robbery gone wrong. If the poison plan failed, the hired killer had been paid $500,000 in advance, with another million promised after the job was done. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team and prompted them to assign undercover security to watch Tommy, knowing he could be targeted. As the evidence mounted, Mr. Sterling watched from his office, growing more devastated with each new revelation. The man who had built an empire on trust and integrity had been betrayed in the most intimate way possible. Tommy often sat with him during these briefings, his street-smart insights helping the billionaire understand how he had been so thoroughly deceived by someone he thought he knew. Mrs. Sterling, meanwhile, continued her daily routine, attending charity galas, hosting dinner parties, and playing the role of devoted wife, unaware that her every move was being monitored. Her recent purchase of additional poison from a dark web supplier was tracked in real time, the delivery intercepted and replaced with a harmless substitute that would later prove her intent beyond any doubt. The investigation team worked around the clock, knowing they needed overwhelming evidence to take down someone with Mrs. Sterling's connections and resources. They photographed, documented, and triple verified every piece of evidence, building an airtight case that would leave no room for her expensive lawyers to maneuver. Chen personally supervised the handling of all evidence, ensuring proper chain of custody and documentation that would stand up to the most intense scrutiny in court. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the team prepared for the most dangerous phase, knowing that Mrs. Sterling was planning something big for the upcoming charity gala. Surveillance had caught her making final preparations for what appeared to be her endgame, a public execution designed to look like a tragic accident. The investigators knew they had to move quickly, but carefully. One wrong move could spell disaster for both Mr. Sterling and the young boy who had risked everything to save him. Crystal glasses clinked and fake laughter echoed through the Sterling mansion as the city's elite gathered for what Mrs. Sterling had planned as her masterpiece, the annual charity gala for children's education. A cruel irony given her attempts to shut down programs for homeless youth. The grand ballroom sparkled with expensive decorations and flowing champagne, while hidden cameras captured every movement of the woman in the red designer gown who moved through her guests like a spider in the center of its web. Tommy watched from a secret security room with Detective Chen and Mr. Sterling, the boy's hands clenched into fists as Mrs. Sterling prepared for her grand finale. She had chosen tonight for its theatrical potential. 200 witnesses would see her beloved husband collapse from an apparent heart attack brought on by the stress of his philanthropic work, the perfect tragic ending to her carefully orchestrated performance. Earlier that day, surveillance had captured her placing the final lethal dose of poison in a special bottle of Mrs. Sterling's favorite wine, a vintage reserved for special occasions that she had doctored over several weeks. To avoid detection, she had even arranged for a prestigious doctor to be present at the gala, someone she had secretly paid to quickly declare natural causes and discourage any further investigation. The security team tracked her every move through hidden cameras as she walked the room, her practiced smile never wavering as she greeted guests and accepted compliments on her charitable work. Detective Chen had positioned plainclothes officers throughout the crowd, each one carefully selected and briefed on their role in the impending arrest. Timing would be crucial to prevent any possible escape or final desperate action. Miss Sterling played his part, perfectly maintaining a facade of ignorance as he circulated among the guests, his every movement shadowed by undercover security. Tommy could see the strain in his face, the hurt in his eyes, as he watched the woman he had loved for 20 years prepare to murder him in front of their closest friends. The boy understood that pain all too well, remembering how it felt to watch his own family destroyed by betrayal. At precisely 9:30, Mrs. Sterling called for attention, her voice carrying across the crowded ballroom as she prepared to make her annual speech about the foundation's work. She raised her glass in a toast, her red lips curved in what only Tommy and a few others knew was a predatory smile, as she signaled a waiter to bring forward the special wine that had been reserved for her husband. Time seemed to slow as Mr. Sterling accepted the poisoned glass. Tommy leaned forward in his chair, heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold on the monitors. Mrs. Sterling began her speech, her words dripping with false sentiment as she praised her husband's dedication to helping others, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing dramatically as she built up to the moment when she would witness his final breath. But before the glass could touch Mrs. Sterling's lips, Detective Chen gave the signal and chaos erupted through the ballroom doors. Strode a team of FBI agents, their badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. From the kitchen service entrance emerged another team of officers, while plainclothes detectives throughout the room drew their weapons. The trap had been sprung with precision, leaving no avenue of escape. Mrs. Sterling's face transformed from practiced charm to savage fury in an instant, the poisoned wine glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the marble floor as silver handcuffs replaced her diamond bracelets. Her scream of rage echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom, a sound of pure hatred that made several guests step back in shock, the carefully constructed mask of sophistication crumbling to reveal the monster beneath. Tommy watched in satisfaction as Detective Chen read the charges, her clear voice cutting through the shocked murmurs of the crowd. Attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, evidence tampering, and more. The list went on as Mrs. Sterling was led away, her designer gown sweeping through the spilled wine like blood on the marble floor, her carefully applied makeup running with tears of fury rather than sorrow. The guests stood frozen in disbelief as federal agents swarmed the mansion collecting final pieces of evidence and documenting the scene. Mr. Sterling remained at the center of the room, his quiet dignity in stark contrast to his wife's dramatic exit. Several of his closest friends moved to stand beside him, offering silent support as the full scope of Mrs. Sterling's betrayal began to emerge. From his position in the security room, Tommy felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Detective Chen had arranged for his role to remain anonymous, protecting him from any possible retaliation, but he could see in Mr. Sterling's face that the night had changed everything. The truth had finally been exposed and justice would be served. The little boy who had spent months watching from the shadows had brought down an elaborate murder plot, and in doing so, had possibly found a new beginning for himself. The packed courthouse buzzed with tension as Tommy took the stand, his new clean-cut appearance in a tailored suit contrasting sharply with the evidence photos showing him in his street clothes. Mr. Sterling had ensured the boy was properly prepared for this moment, but nothing could fully ready him for facing Mrs. Sterling's team of 7 top lawyers who loomed like predators eager to tear apart the testimony of a homeless child. The lead defense attorney, Marcus Reynolds, known for breaking witnesses with his brutal cross-examination style, approached the stand, his expensive Italian shoes clicking ominously on the hardwood floor. Tommy caught a glimpse of Mrs. Sterling sitting at the defense table, her once perfect appearance now showing signs of strain from weeks in custody, but her eyes still held that calculating coldness he remembered from the kitchen window. District Attorney Sarah Martinez began her direct examination, gently leading Tommy through his story. His voice started barely above a whisper, but grew stronger with each word as he recounted that fateful night at the mansion. The jury leaned forward, straining to catch every detail as he described watching Mrs. Sterling through the kitchen window. He pulled out his old phone, now stored in an evidence bag, and explained how he had thought to document everything. The evidence photos flashed across the courtroom screens, showing the progression of Mrs. Sterling's poisoning attempts. Tommy identified each image, explaining the significance of what the jury was seeing. His detailed knowledge of the mansion's routine and staff movements, lending credibility to his testimony that even Reynolds couldn't shake. The boy described the exact times, movements, and patterns that matched perfectly with security footage. When Reynolds finally rose for cross-examination, his towering figure attempting to intimidate the young witness, Tommy sat straighter, remembering Mr. Sterling's words about speaking truth to power. The defense attorney started with questions about Tommy's background, trying to paint him as an unreliable witness, a street kid with a history of petty theft. But Tommy remained calm, acknowledging his past while explaining how watching his parents die had changed him. Mrs. Sterling shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Tommy revealed how he had collected empty poison packages from the mansion's trash, gathering evidence long before anyone knew he was watching. Her carefully crafted image of aristocratic sophistication cracked slightly as the boy described overhearing her late-night phone conversations with her lover. The jury watched her reactions closely, noting how she flinched at specific details. Reynolds attempted to suggest that Tommy had fabricated the story for attention and financial gain, but the boy countered with details that only someone who had spent months observing the mansion could know. He described Mrs. Sterling's secret habits, her hidden gestures, the way she always checked her lipstick in the reflection of the kitchen window before meeting her lover, details too specific and mundane to be invented. The courtroom fell silent as Tommy described the night he realized what the purple package contained, his voice breaking slightly as he recounted the death of his dog Max from the same poison. The jury members wiped tears as he explained how that experience had helped him recognize the deadly substance Mrs. Sterling had been using. Several jurors glared at her when Tommy described her complaints about homeless people contaminating her neighborhood. Detective Chen, sitting in the front row, nodded approvingly as Tommy referenced evidence she had uncovered during the investigation, his testimony providing the human context for the mountain of technical evidence. The prosecution had assembled his story of watching Mrs. Sterling's kindness while his wife plotted his murder resonated deeply with the jury, creating a narrative that all the defense team's objections couldn't overcome. As the day wore on, Tommy remained steady, even as Reynolds grew increasingly frustrated by his inability to trip up the young witness. The boy had spent years learning to read people on the streets and easily recognized the attorney's tactics, answering questions with a street smart wisdom that sometimes drew small smiles from the judge. Mr. Sterling watched from his seat behind the prosecution table, his face showing pride in the boy's courage. When Tommy finally stepped down from the witness stand hours later, the impact of his testimony hung heavy in the courtroom. Even Mrs. Sterling's expensive legal team looked deflated, their strategy of discrediting the young witness having backfired spectacularly. Instead of appearing as an unreliable street kid, Tommy had shown himself to be observant, resilient, and most importantly truthful. His simple, honest account of what he had witnessed carrying more weight than all their legal maneuvering. The day ended with Tommy exhausted but triumphant. Mr. Sterling waited for him outside the courtroom, wrapping him in a protective hug that spoke volumes about how their relationship had evolved from stranger to family. Detective Chen approached with a smile, telling Tommy that his testimony had been more powerful than any evidence she had uncovered. The boy, who had once been invisible to society, had become the key to bringing down a calculating killer who had thought herself untouchable. Mrs. Sterling's carefully constructed world came crashing down spectacularly on the trial's 10th day when her lover Anthony Blake took the stand, his testimony transforming the courtroom into a theater of betrayal. Blake, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that matched his perfectly styled hair, had struck a deal with the prosecution in exchange for immunity, his revelations sending shockwaves through the gallery. The ambitious executive detailed their 2-year affair, describing how Mrs. Sterling had first approached him at a business conference with an irresistible proposition she would help him take control of Sterling Industries in exchange for his help in eliminating her husband. Their romantic entanglement had merely been a bonus, a way to ensure his complete loyalty as they plotted Mrs. Sterling's demise. Blake reviewed carefully preserved text messages and recorded conversations that left no doubt about their murderous intentions. Tommy sat beside Mr. Sterling, watching the color drain from Mrs. Sterling's face as her former lover methodically destroyed her defense. Blake produced a personal diary detailing their meetings, secret codes, and backup plans, including a scheme to frame one of Mrs. Sterling's closest friends for the murder if their poison plot failed. The diary contained Mrs. Sterling's handwritten notes about poison dosages and anticipated symptoms, showing a level of premeditation that horrified even her own lawyers. But the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source. Sarah Sterling, the couple's 19-year-old daughter who had been away at college during most of the plotting, took the stand, her hands trembling as she faced her mother. The young woman described finding a hidden laptop containing detailed research on untraceable poisons and offshore bank accounts. She had discovered the truth during a surprise visit home, but had been too terrified of her mother to come forward. Sarah revealed years of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse she had endured witnessing her mother's countless affairs and schemes. The jury listened in horror as she described overhearing conversations about plans to eliminate her father and take control of his empire. Mrs. Sterling had even suggested that Sarah would have a tragic accident of her own if she ever revealed what she knew. The young woman's testimony painted a picture of a sociopath who viewed family members as mere chess pieces in her game of power and wealth. The prosecution presented forensic evidence showing Mrs. Sterling had been practicing with different poisons for months before beginning her attempts on her husband. Detective Chen testified about discovering a hidden laboratory in a remote property owned by Mrs. Sterling under an alias where she had tested various toxins on small animals, developing the perfect cocktail that would mimic natural causes. The detailed records of these experiments found at the property revealed a methodical mind devoid of empathy. Mrs. Sterling's own daughter continued her testimony, describing how her mother had carefully cultivated relationships with medical examiners and law enforcement officials, ensuring that any investigation into Mrs. Sterling's death would be cursory at best. Sarah produced emails showing her mother had been planning her husband's murder for years, even before meeting Blake, waiting for the perfect opportunity and accomplice to execute her plan. The defense team watched helplessly as their strategy collapsed. Witness after witness came forward with damning evidence. The Sterling mansion's former head of security testified about being fired after questioning Mrs. Sterling's late-night activities. The family doctor admitted being pressured to diagnose Mrs. Sterling with a heart condition that didn't exist, and the corporate financial officer revealed elaborate schemes to siphon company funds into secret accounts. Throughout the devastating testimony, Mrs. Sterling maintained her mask of cold indifference, but Tommy, who had spent months studying her, noticed the subtle signs of her cracking facade, the slight tremor in her hands, the occasional flicker of rage in her eyes, the way she pressed her perfectly manicured nails into her palms until they left marks, her carefully constructed image of sophistication barely concealing the fury of a cornered predator. Mr. Sterling sat stoically through each revelation, his face showing the pain of not just his wife's betrayal, but the recognition that their entire marriage had been built on lies. Tommy often caught him staring at old family photos during court breaks, wondering if any of the happy moments had been real. The boy understood that kind of pain, remembering his own feelings of betrayal when he learned the truth about his parents' deaths. As the defense crumbled, Mrs. Sterling's expensive legal team began turning on each other, with her lead attorney, Marcus Reynolds, requesting to withdraw from the case, citing ethical concerns. This final betrayal seemed to break something in Mrs. Sterling, who suddenly stood up in the middle of her daughter's testimony and began screaming accusations at everyone in the courtroom, her composed mask finally shattering completely to reveal the monster beneath. Court officers had to restrain her as she lunged toward her daughter, her incoherent threats and ravings providing the final confirmation of her guilt for any jurors who still harbored doubts. The tension in the courthouse could be cut with a knife as the jury filed back in after only 2 hours of deliberation, their faces grave with the weight of their decision. Mrs. Sterling stood proud and cold beside her remaining lawyers, her designer outfit and perfect makeup a stark contrast to her daughter's tear-stained face. In the front row, Tommy sat between Mr. Sterling and Detective Chen, his small hand gripping the billionaire's arm in silent support. The judge, a stern woman who had presided over many high-profile cases, called for the verdict to be read. The court clerk stood, her voice clear and unwavering in the hushed chamber, as she announced guilty on all counts: attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, embezzlement, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and money laundering, each guilty verdict landing like a hammer blow in the silent courtroom. Mrs. Sterling's mask of indifference finally cracked as the full weight of her crimes was laid bare, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the defense table until her knuckles turned white. When the judge announced that sentencing would begin immediately, her face drained of all color, knowing that her chances of avoiding a lengthy prison term had vanished with the swift verdict. The prosecution had recommended the maximum sentence on all charges. Victim impact statements began with Sarah Sterling approaching the podium, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as she described the devastating impact of her mother's betrayal. The young woman spoke of years of manipulation and fear of watching her mother systematically destroy their family while maintaining a facade of perfection. The jury members who had voted to convict wiped tears as Sarah described how she would never feel safe again knowing what her mother was capable of. Miss Sterling spoke next, his testimony focusing not on his own pain but on the broader impact of his wife's actions. He detailed how her attempts to dismantle his charitable works had affected countless vulnerable people in their community. Tommy watched as the billionaire described discovering that the woman he had loved had been actively working to destroy everything he had built, not just their marriage, but his life's work of helping others. When it came time for Mrs. Sterling to speak before sentencing, she launched into a tirade that shocked even her remaining lawyers. She showed no remorse, instead attacking everyone from her daughter to the jury, claiming they were all conspiring against her. Her voice rose to a shriek as she pointed at Tommy, calling him a lying street rat who had destroyed her perfect life. Court officers had to restrain her as she attempted to rush at the boy, her designer heels clicking madly on the marble floor. The judge listened to her outburst with growing disapproval, noting that Mrs. Sterling's behavior only confirmed the jury's findings about her character. When the time came for sentencing, Her Honor spoke of the calculated nature of the crimes, the betrayal of family trust, and the potential devastating impact on the community. Had the scheme succeeded, she emphasized how Mrs. Sterling had not only attempted to murder her husband, but had been willing to destroy countless lives in pursuit of wealth and power. The sentence, when it came, was devastating: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for the financial crimes, ensuring that Mrs. Sterling would never again see freedom. The judge specifically mentioned Tommy's courage in coming forward, noting that without his intervention, an innocent man would have died and a murderer would have inherited not just his wealth but control over charitable works that supported thousands of vulnerable people. Mrs. Sterling finally lost her composure completely as she was led away in handcuffs, her screams echoing through the courthouse corridors. She cursed her husband, her daughter, the judge, and especially Tommy, her carefully crafted appearance crumbling as she fought against the court officers, her designer outfit becoming disheveled, her perfect makeup streaking with tears of rage rather than remorse. Sarah collapsed into her father's arms as her mother was led away, while Tommy stood nearby watching the woman who had once seemed so powerful and intimidating reduced to a raging prisoner. Detective Chen placed a protective hand on his shoulder, knowing that his testimony had been crucial in bringing justice, but also understanding the emotional toll it had taken on the young boy. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Mrs. Sterling gathered both Tommy and Sarah close. His family, forever changed but somehow stronger through this ordeal. The media waiting outside would want statements and photographs, but for now they remained in the quiet courtroom processing the justice that had finally been served. Tommy looked up at the man he had saved, feeling for the first time in years that he truly belonged somewhere. The judge approached them privately after the session ended, commending Tommy for his bravery and insight. She noted that in her 30 years on the bench, she had rarely seen such compelling testimony from someone so young, or such a clear example of courage in the face of power. Tommy stood a little straighter under her praise, understanding that his decision to speak up had not only saved a life, but had helped restore justice to a family torn apart by betrayal. Cameras flashed and reporters clamored as Mrs. Sterling signed the adoption papers, making Tommy officially his son. 6 months after the trial that had captivated the nation, the boy who once scrounged for food in dumpsters now sat in a judge's chambers, wearing a suit that matched his new father's, watching as years of loneliness and survival finally gave way to belonging. The simple act of signing papers transformed 2 broken lives into a new family. Sarah Sterling stood beside them, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched her new little brother become official. She had spent the months since the trial healing from her mother's betrayal, finding strength in helping Tommy adjust to his new life. The two had formed an unbreakable bond, both understanding the pain of betrayal and the courage required to speak truth to power. Their shared experiences creating a sibling relationship deeper than blood. The transformation of the Sterling mansion reflected the changes in their lives. Where Mrs. Sterling had once maintained cold perfection, now warmth and laughter echoed through the halls. Tommy and Sarah had worked together to convert the formal sitting rooms into comfortable living spaces, replacing pristine antiques with comfortable furniture that invited people to stay. The kitchen, once a place of hidden poison, had become the heart of their home, where family meals and easy conversation flowed freely. Mr. Sterling watched his children with pride, seeing how Tommy had blossomed from a scared street survivor into a confident young man. The boy still maintained his keen observation skills, but now used them to help his father identify worthy causes for the Sterling Foundation, which had expanded its mission to focus specifically on helping homeless youth across the city. The purple poison package that Tommy had first spotted now sat in a glass case in Sterling's office, a reminder that heroes could come from the most unexpected places. Detective Chen had become a regular visitor to the mansion, helping Tommy process his testimony and its aftermath. She had recognized something special in the boy during the investigation and had begun mentoring him, teaching him how his street smarts could be channeled into a future career in law enforcement. Tommy absorbed every lesson, eager to help other kids who, like him, needed someone to speak up for them. The story of the homeless boy who saved a billionaire had captured public imagination, but the real story happened behind the headlines in quiet moments, like Sarah teaching Tommy to ride a bike, Mr. Sterling helping with homework, or family game nights that often dissolved into fits of laughter. The Sterling mansion that had once been a symbol of cold aristocratic perfection had transformed into a true home where healing and love replaced pretense and betrayal. Tommy and Mr. Sterling worked together to expand the network of youth shelters across the city, using the boys' first-hand experience to design programs that actually helped kids escape the streets. Sarah contributed her own skills, developing counseling programs for young people dealing with family trauma, their shared mission healing not just their own wounds, but reaching out to help others who were still struggling. The mansion gardens, once Mrs. Sterling's pride and joy, had been redesigned into a community space where homeless youth could find safety and support. Tommy often sat in the same spot where he had first witnessed the murder plot, now watching other kids find their way to safety and opportunity. The security cameras that had once captured evidence of attempted murder now watched over children playing freely in a space designed for healing. Miss Sterling had changed as well, the experience of betrayal and redemption softening his corporate persona, making him more approachable and understanding. He often said that losing his wife but gaining two extraordinary children had taught him the true meaning of family. The man who had once spent his evenings reviewing business reports now made time every day to hear about his children's adventures and dreams. On the one-year anniversary of the trial, Tommy stood at the podium of a newly opened youth center named in his honor, his story inspiring other kids to speak up and seek help. Mr. Sterling and Sarah sat in the front row, their pride evident as the former street kid who had risked everything to save a stranger shared his message of hope and courage with others facing similar struggles, their family story proving that sometimes the worst betrayals could lead to the most beautiful beginnings.